Hello, everyone. Welcome to Concordia University's Forest Space, and thank you for joining us for today's event, Feminist Futures in Law. Now, to help situate you, we are streaming to YouTube, live from Forest Space, and we are located here on unceded Indigenous lands in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. It is very much my pleasure to hand it over to their co-organizers for today's event, Una and Melissa. Welcome.
Testing. Oh, amazing. Welcome, folks. So happy you're all here. Thank you, Forest Space, for this wonderful introduction and starting us off with that land acknowledgement. So before we begin, I think it's important for us to recognize as feminists how settler colonialism has and continues to negatively impact Indigenous communities here in Turtle Island, but internationally as well. As such, we have a collective responsibility together to decolonize our institutions and while supporting Indigenous right to self-determination, sovereignty, and right to self-government. As we gather here today on these unceded lands to discuss law with an intersectional approach, and we must recognize our responsibility to disrupt harmful practices that are predisposed on land theft, dispossession, and violence. This starts with prioritizing conversations with Indigenous communities and with following their leadership on how to enact positive change.
So in the spirit of starting conversations, we'd like to kick off this event by introducing ourselves again. So my name is Melissa. This is my co-moderator, Una. This event has been 5 months in the making now, and it all started in a classroom at the Simone de Beauvoir Institute, where we met our co-organizers, Emily, Sophie, and Donna, and we quickly found a common interest in social justice and potentially pursuing an education in law. So drawing from our diverse backgrounds, we thought that it would be relevant, especially amid today's current context, to have these conversations about the possibilities of reconciling the law with feminist, anti-racist, and decolonial values. And we quickly noticed that these questions resonated with a lot of people, so we're very humbled and excited by the fact that everybody showed up today, and we're especially grateful to be joined by our panelists. So we're here with Laura Cardenas. Laura actively works on class actions, estates, employment, and constitutional law matters, in addition to her general practice in civil and commercial litigation. So as part of her practice, Laura represents both individual and institutional clients. She has appeared before all levels of court in Quebec and has argued at the Supreme Court of Canada. Laura also has experience, publishes, and gives conferences in the areas of family and charter law with a specific focus on discrimination and LGBTQ+ communities. She joined a firm here in Montreal, IMK, in 2021, after articling and practicing as a litigator with an international firm and serving as a law clerk for the Honorable Justice Sheila L. Martin at the Supreme Court of Canada. During her studies, Laura was also an editor-in-chief at the McGill Law Journal, and she received multiple awards for her legal articles and her involvement in faculty life. We're also joined by Lex Gill. Lex is a Montreal-based lawyer with a practice rooted in a commitment to social, environmental, and economic justice. She works at Trudel, Johnson, and L'Espérance, a law firm known for class actions and public interest litigation, and is a former clerk to Chief Justice Richard Wagner at the Supreme Court of Canada. In addition to her practice, Lex teaches an upper year public law seminar at McGill's Faculty of Law and serves as a fellow at the Citizen Lab, where she contributes to issues of freedom of expression, human rights, and emerging technologies. She also graduated from McGill's Faculty of Law, is a Concordia University alumna, and is a member of both the Law Society of Ontario and Le Barreau du Québec. Lastly, we're also joined by Nancy Tapias-Dorado. She's the Social Justice Center's 2023 to 2024 Barry Pashak Postdoctoral Fellow at Concordia University. She's a doctor in sociology at the University of Oxford, a human rights lawyer from the Universities of Essex and Javriana. She's also a visiting fellow at McGill Center for Human Rights and Legal Pluralism, as well as a former postdoctoral fellow at UQAM. She's dedicated her life to working with and for neglected communities and human rights defenders at risk in the Americas, mainly Indigenous women leaders in the Abya and Turtle Island. So without further ado, please join us in welcoming these three panelists. Thank you.
Wow, talk about that, a mouthful of compliments and just accomplishments. It's really great to have you all here. So before we actually jump into the conversation, I just want to let everybody know, have a seat, get comfortable. If you have questions, hold on to your burning questions because there will be a period for question and answers, followed by some time to mingle and enjoy our food and drinks brought to you by the Hive. And lastly, I just will let you know if ever anyone needs the washrooms, they're outside of this building and you just have to walk a little bit and they're going to be on your right and they're gender neutral bathrooms. All right, well, thank you for joining us today. We are so excited that you're here. And as we were talking, this has been 5 months in the making and the day has finally come. So I think the first thing we want to know is just how does it feel to be at Concordia or to be back at Concordia for some?
Is it on? Oh,
Yeah.
You know what's funny is when we started this event, they were like, are there any special requests? And I said, no special requests. The only thing is I don't want to speak first. But I'm excited to be back at Concordia. Concordia is where I learned how to be an organizer and how to be an activist. I did my undergrad here. And I think the school just has this incredible storied history of being on the front lines of racial justice organizing, economic justice organizing, student mobilization, and I think that it's really just such a joy to be at a school that's known and cherishes this work kind of on the bleeding edge of social justice. So I'm stoked to be back.
Hi, and thank you for having me over for the event. It's funny, what's not part of my bio that was read out is that I was also at Concordia just about 10 years ago, a bit more, in film studies. So for me, it's funny to be back and remember how, yes, I was in film studies, and then I went to do a master's in Asia-Pacific policy studies in BC, and then I came back, and then I went into law, and just, it reminds me of all of the ways in which my career and my path have just gone in different directions that I didn't expect, which I think is actually very appropriate for today's event as well. So it's nice, actually, that this event is taking place here and to be back for it.
Okay, thank you so much for this wonderful invitation. I am very happy to be here. This is such an important topic for me that when I heard about it, I was immediately like, yes, I'll be there. I'm very happy to be at Concordia, especially because I am the postdoctoral fellow of the Social Justice Center, which is precisely a key topic of this conversation today. And also because this was the first university that welcomed me to this country. So I am always grateful with Concordia. I love the fact that Concordia recognizes its potential, but also its past, its limitations. So it feels very human, very diverse, and that's something that I truly love, and I'm very happy to be here with you. Thank you.
Amazing. So I'm really curious, as you know, the title is called Feminist Futures in Law. I'm curious what you guys thought when you saw that title or when we asked you to be part of this event. Like, what were the first kind of thoughts you thought? Nancy, if you'd like to begin.
First thoughts is, yes, absolutely, this is a key topic. It has advanced a lot in the last decades, but it needs to continue advancing very much. At many levels. It's not only a human rights topic, which is the area where I specialize, international human rights law. It has to go through all the different areas, even those that people usually believe they have nothing to do with gender or feminism or intersectionality. Well, let me tell you, they all have to do with that. And a part of that, I truly believe that is not just law in abstract, it's the system that law sustains. I'm just going to leave it like that for now.
I think I wasn't able to think of just one thing when I was trying to think about feminism in law or future feminists in law or the future of feminism in law or feminist futures in law, because I think in one way it's what is your future in law, and I think that's kind of what you're trying to be here and figure out for yourselves, and does that match and can you see yourselves in it? Part of it is the feminism in the law and how the law needs to evolve, and I think that's what you're getting towards, and how that's a very slow process at times, but it's a very important one, and that's one where you're needed. And I think we all kind of envisage what a feminist future legal system can be in a slightly different way, and the important power that feminism has is to empower you to achieve that, what you see as the future and what you see as a more just legal system.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love this idea. I especially love that it's plural, feminist futures. I think that on one hand, this theme is really an invitation to imagine something like almost in the sort of like feminist science fiction tradition, right? What would it mean to have a legal system that is feminist at all? It's almost outside of the scope of what, as a practicing day-to-day litigator, I can imagine. But so I think it's like this, on one hand, this really optimistic and invitation to imagine what a legal system might look like if it was truly informed by a commitment to gender equality. And I mean, obviously gender equality is meaningless without also thinking about economic justice and racial equality. It's a necessarily hollow idea. So I think it's really just like a big invitation to think about a world in which justice might be a little bit more real. But on the other hand, I think that there's this like very practical reflex I have, which, we tend to talk about the like social change as like the arc of justice is long, but it bends towards justice. And like, I don't know that that's true. I think that we've been sort of enculturated into this like model of progress that is very linear. We're sort of taught to think that tomorrow is necessarily going to be better. And I don't know that, when you think about like the America's like misogynistic id is in like a 50-50 like dead stalemate in the 2024 election. Like, I don't know that we are guaranteed a feminist future that's much better than the one that we inherited from our mothers. And I think that, so when I think about this idea of a feminist future, it's also an invitation to join the fight to build the kind of future that we want to see, and not take for granted that we're necessarily situated in some sort of like linear arc towards progress and equality. Yeah, that's what that brings up for me.
Amazing. I think that those are great responses. And I think it's the best way to start this event because as you are all here, I have a feeling that some of you are interested in law or maybe feminism. And to bring a little back what you said, Nancy, and like said, is justice is, there is a potential of it being real. And not only that, is that as we're looking at law, we're looking at the way that the system supports the law. So hopefully these are questions that we'll be able to, or maybe these are understandings that you'll have a better chance to think about as you leave today. And I think this could move us into the next part where I would really love to know what and how did you become interested in social justice? I know it's a really big open-ended question, so feel free to answer that however you will. But I think for young ears here that are really eager to know what drives people, this is a really great way to start. If Laura or Nancy would like to start, because I know.
Because she doesn't want to.
Exactly.
It's funny, I was thinking about this question when you sent it, and I don't have any kind of one moment where I became interested in social justice. I think it was a very organic process, and as we can see from my informal bio, I kind of tended to go one direction and then another. But I think there are commonalities to all the things that I did, and I think what really got me interested in approaching the issues that I see every day from a social justice angle, and also being interested in fighting for social justice as much as I can in my day-to-day work, is just seeing how in the system there hasn't been thought given to certain people in certain cases or certain situations, and just seeing that over and over again. And I remember when I was in law school, I started writing papers about like how, for instance, this law was clearly written thinking that it was inclusive of all families, and thinking, we're like so progressive, we're thinking about people who are like, I think at one point I wrote about a law about posthumously conceived children. Like clearly people were thinking ahead, they were thinking different kinds of families, and I was like, but you're not thinking LGBTQ plus families, because we don't use assisted reproductive technologies in the same way as the people you're thinking about, and there's just a gap. And nobody thinks of it, and nobody sees it, and it just drove me mad. Like, and I wrote an article where I think I was very angry when I wrote it. I think when I read it back, I'm like, you were very angry. I don't know if other people read it that way, but that's kind of the energy that I have when I approach topics or articles or cases that are about the fight for social justice is I see a gap somewhere, and it just drives me mad that some people weren't thought of, that they're still not being thought of, and that nobody is taking issue with it. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Absolutely.
but-
I appreciate how you're bringing in that emotion of anger, and anger being as a force to be able to create change, and not just being like, I'm so angry when I wrote this, but actually like, no, it's a really good emotion to have, and I appreciate that you're bringing that in, because it's something that should be fostered.
Okay, I'll go with that look. You may have noticed my accent. I am Latin American. I'm actually from Colombia. Colombia is a country that has been immersed in a war for more than 66 decades, 60 years and more. And when I was a child, we could look at the news or even be advised not to go out because something might happen. And of course, growing up, I could clearly see in many places inequality, many homeless people. And I was always like, what's going on? So then I went to study law to try to see how law could help address this kind of injustices and conflict situation. And I studied law, and there were no answers. And then I felt that I was studying law on this side, and I was looking at reality on this other side, and there was no connection. So discussing that with some professors and students, we decided to create a group of volunteers to visit prisoners in the worst conditions in Colombia. And that's how originated the Voluntariado Penitenciario, a group of volunteers that would visit these prisoners. And it became such a very active and important group with many problems, because not all law professors would be happy that somebody from Javeriana University would be doing that with the students and the professors, and that was not really for lawyers. That might be for some another profession, but not for lawyers. But we insisted, and after all that process, I was hired by the faculty to develop a program in human rights, including this kind of initiative, but also to participate in the human rights moot court competitions. And in that process, this initiative and the whole thing became so big that I was invited as the young leader from Colombia to the Women Waging Peace initiative that was led by Professor Swanihan at Harvard University. So when I was literally very young, I was there with about 100 other women from other conflict area situations. And my mind was just open to the rest of the world, because I was like, hang on a minute, I have been talking about injustice, I have been talking about inequality, but I am a woman, and nobody has actually opened my mind to this other world of women facing violence in a differentiated way, but also women being at the forefront of the struggles, trying to open spaces to develop peace processes and other alternatives, of course, very different to what was happening in these conflict area situations. So that's how I was totally engaged with human rights, but also how I totally became engaged with women. And then once I was working with women, I was like, but hang on a minute, what about LGBTIQ plus people? So that's how I became involved in other projects from Pensar Institute, the think tank of the university, where we managed to open a more friendly space in Bogota, the capital city of Colombia, for LGBTQI people, with the neighborhood called Chapinero. So I was already very much involved in that, and of course I couldn't stop. I went abroad, and after my master's at Essex University, I was hired by Amnesty International, almost a decade as a researcher on the situation of human rights defenders. And then, of course, I was like, but I haven't actually looked into what's going on with indigenous peoples and how indigenous peoples and their leaders, and especially indigenous women leaders, have been targeted and persecuted and attacked and stigmatized because they are indigenous women facing and challenging mega projects and the most powerful people in the world. So after all that, and I will stop there because it can be like very long and detailed, but after that I was like, law is fundamental. we definitely need to continue advancing. But for me at that point, I needed to broaden my analytical and methodological tools, and that's when I decided to do my PhD at the University of Oxford in sociology, because I wanted to challenge my own approach to law and my own practice and knowledge of law. And that's why I'm now in this postdoc, further developing in this dialogue between Canada and Latin America, because when we come from Latin America, or at least that was my approach, oh, Canada, wow, the solution is going to reveal to me, because that was my understanding, It's a very democratic, peaceful country, and it is indeed. But when I started to learn about the situation of indigenous women leaders facing mega projects and all the abuses around that, it was very much the same as in Latin America. And that's the work I mainly focus on. So it's all about that. That's when I met you. That's exactly what I said. This is kind of my topic. Thank you.
I remember you saw the poster and you're like, this is it. This is what we do. This is happy to be here. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, like how I think so. How did I become involved in social justice work? It's kind of, it's almost hard to imagine a time before that, because I think that my politics are so much part of who I am that it's hard to sort of separate. But I think that I think that what's clear is that I've always had a bit of an underdog bias, and I think that maybe like pre-exists the politics in some ways, and I see it in like in being in love with like punk music as a teenager, and I see it in loving science fiction, and I see it in the kind of like artistic communities I was involved in my late teens, and in fact even when I came to Concordia, some of the first political work I was doing was really with this group of like culture jamming activists. We were doing things like organizing tea parties in public spaces and taking corporate ads out of bathroom stalls and replacing them with art. And and even when a couple years later, when I ended up through a series of strange events, ended up president of the Concordia Student Union during the 2012 student strike. One of the first sort of like big actions we did and like involved like filling up 1,000 helium red balloons in Reggie's without telling the administration and unleashing them with a giant sign in the hall building. And so I think that there is like a sort of like there's like a joy and playfulness to like my understanding of my politics as a feminist, but also my ideas about social justice that is like a little bit pre-political. And I think that is like a thread that goes through my work from the student strike. I didn't think somebody like me could be a lawyer. It never occurred to me that someone like me could be a lawyer. I don't think that idea occurred to me until I was like in my early 20s, at which point I was like shuffled off to law school, almost despite myself. Or I shuffled myself off to law school almost despite myself. But so my first sort of like legal social justice work was really around sort of individual liberties issues. It was like triggered around some of the mass arrests that happened during the 2012 student strike. That really informed my politics. I think I was in handcuffs before I ever thought of being a lawyer. But I think those experiences are really truly formative to how I practice now. And so I got involved with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, which is Canada's sort of foremost organization working around individual rights and freedoms. There I did work around a little bit around equality rights, but especially around fundamental freedoms, around national security, around privacy and surveillance. And those are areas that are like honestly only interesting if you come at them with like a critical feminist lens, and then they're everything. And so there was that kind of human rights work going on. I ended up doing increasingly work around emerging technologies and realizing that there was a huge gap in how we talked about human rights and emerging technologies from a feminist perspective, particularly around freedom of expression, right? I think that one of the kind of big contributions in that work was around saying that women and gender nonconforming people have rights other than safety. I think that there's so much of a discourse around things like online violence, online harms, and this continues to be the case. This is like very much in the news right now in Canada. But this idea that like the only interest that like women have or girls have is like their safety, and not like that they have the right to freedom of expression, that they have the right to political organizing, that they have the right to like real security, flourishing, autonomy, freedom in a meaningful sense. And so that was like work that I really wanted to build around. And then I ended up kind of building a practice that is focused on social justice in lots of different ways at a law firm that is like very unusual for its commitment to social justice as sort of the core of its business model. We only do plaintiff side class actions and public interest litigation. We only really take cases where we think that there's some sort of public interest dimension in the work that we do. And there I'm part of a sort of like community of practice at our firm that is really constantly thinking about how we might make the world like a slightly less awful place through our work as lawyers. So I think like that's what the trajectory looks like.
So you all touched a little bit on your foray into social justice spaces, as well as how that informed your legal careers. Is there a moment in your career that you're proud of, or a project that you would like to share?
Oh, it's my turn, sorry. Okay, I didn't prepare something specific. I feel like there's lots of cool things that we've done recently. Maybe I can talk to you about a case, maybe not the most obvious case from a feminist perspective. From my perspective, like a clear feminist angle to this, but one of the cases I'm most proud of having worked on is a constitutional challenge on behalf of the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. So our firm represents the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and a constitutional challenge to the police powers that allow police officers to stop drivers for no reason, suspicionless roadside stops. And these stops were, the Supreme Court in 1990 decided that it was constitutional for police officers to conduct these kinds of roadside stops, despite the fact that they represent an arbitrary detention and a big intrusion into people's civil liberties, right? Like, so we're not stopping somebody because they have a taillight broken or because they're speeding. We're stopping people for no reason at all, ostensibly to verify like their license and their registration and the mechanical state of their vehicle, this kind of thing. Now, these stops were notorious before and became far more notorious after this decision, to the point where by the time we took the case alongside the plaintiff's lawyer, they were known as like the driving while black stops. I had never been stopped while driving under these powers. I didn't know any white people who ever had, and like the evidence at trial demonstrated that that's because white people are not stopped under these powers at all. This police authority is used massively and disproportionately as a racial profiling tool, one that like overwhelmingly targets young black men. And so we intervened at the trial level. It was a almost 7-week trial last year, 2 years ago, sorry. I was like this pregnant at the time. And in a 200-page judgment, a judge of the Superior Court agreed, despite the fact that there was binding Supreme Court precedent, that this power was in fact unconstitutional, that it was discriminatory, and that it should be invalidated. Now, that decision is going to the Court of Appeal in March. We will be there again. But from my perspective, it's like really one of those examples of the ways in which, as a lawyer, litigation can make a difference. This kind of strategic constitutional litigation can make a difference. It can change the material conditions of people's lives. Invalidating this power will hopefully mean that less people are stopped, less people are subject to these degrading, humiliating, unnecessary stops, that we have better controls over police authority, and I mean like the amount of work that's involved in doing something like this, just to think, that you're making this like essentially like marginal tweak to the legal system and that the rest of the apparatus of like profound injustice remains intact. I mean, complicated to think about, but there's no shortage of work to do. So that's something that I'm really proud of. And I think as a feminist, I think that it's really essential for me that when I think about this kind of legal work, that you're always looking at it from a gender perspective. And this is actually an area where young black men are disproportionately affected. And having an equality analysis that's like robust and critical and intersectional enough to accommodate that, I think is like part of what helped us get through that trial with a lot of integrity and coherence. So.
I do want to just ask before we jump into the next answer, if you just want to maybe specify for those in the audience what you mean by litigation. Just because we do have some with us, I don't want to assume where we're all at. So to make sure that we're all on the same page on the conversation, if you just want to clarify a little bit what you mean by that.
Sure. Litigation is, so not all lawyers are litigators, I guess is what that means. So litigation is really like a part of the practice of law where you're making representations before the courts and you're seeking something on behalf of a client. And so like Laura and I are both litigators for different firms, and we both practice in front of the courts, whereas other kinds of lawyers might be doing more like
contracts or reviewing documents for corporations who want to merge with other corporations. So usually that's how we kind of separated between the corporate transactional side and then the litigation side, which I usually define as anything that has the potential to go to court, anything that's a dispute between people.
Amazing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So like Lex, I'm also a litigator, so all that I do is things that have the potential to go to court, either because there's a fight or because somebody can't have an answer to their issue without going to ask the court for its intervention. And I think in my practice, in terms of the social justice kind of related cases, there tend to be two kinds. One is the kind that Lex was talking about, which is it's a big case, it gets a lot of press, yours did. It makes a statement, as much as it also makes a difference in people's lives. It makes a huge statement, which has a symbolic impact beyond also what the practical impact might be in a case. And I've worked on a couple of those, but I think usually the ones that kind of make me feel proudest personally are the ones that nobody will ever hear about. Like the ones that just change maybe one person's life, but you know that person and you know what it means to them. And it's just so powerful. And little things add up, I think, and do make changes eventually, sometimes institutional changes. But it's very funny to approach it from a different way like that. And I think the case that I'm most proud of, or that really made me the happiest when it worked out, is one where I was representing a throuple. And so they were 3 guys in a polyamorous relationship. 2 of them had been in a couple before, and they had wanted to adopt a kid for a while. So they were in the process of adopting through what we call the banque mixte here in Quebec with the Direction de la Protection de la Jeunesse. That means that they're in a process where they get evaluated, you fill up a lot of paperwork, you're on a list for ages, like years you wait. And then you go through what they call a psychosocial evaluation, and if you get it, then you become a foster family for a period of time could be very short, usually it's relatively long, until maybe the circumstances are such that you can adopt a child. Maybe you can't, and you're just a foster family forever. That's what you sign up for. Sign up to foster, to adopt. And so these 2 guys had been on that process. They had been in it for years, I think 6 or 7 years by the time I met them. And then they got contacted by the DPJ, Direction de la Protection de la Jeunesse, to go to the evaluation. And they mentioned to the evaluators, by the way, so you know, now we're in a throuple with somebody else, like this is a change, didn't start up this way, now it is. This guy is with us. We know only 2 guys can be parents-in-law. We can't be 3 parents-in-law. We understand. We don't like that, but we understand. And so we want to be 2 parents, 2 fathers, and he's going to be a parental figure. He's not going to be a parent, but you should know because he's going to be a part of the kid's life. And the DPJ said, well then, you are out of the program. You cannot be a foster family and adopt because you can't have 3 parents. They were like, but we don't want to be 3 parents. We want to be 2 parents, and he's going to be a parental figure. Uncles can be parental figures. Grandparents, lots of situations. You might have a roommate, somebody else who's there in the kid's life. But the DPJ was just not having it like it went on like that for weeks and weeks and months, and then they came to us. And then I got angry, first thing. I got angry. I got one of my colleagues to work on this with me, and we had to react fast and write a long proceeding fast, which we did because we were angry, so that meant we worked a lot, very hard, but happy to do it in a sense, because we're fueled by all that passion. And we wrote a very long proceeding, essentially just a document that you file to start a lawsuit, telling the DPJ how this was wrong, how this was discrimination, because they just rejected these guys and refused to even evaluate them on their merits, on their abilities as parents because they're in a throuple. We sent that off to the DPJ. They didn't get back to us right away. They had like 15 days to say if they were going to defend themselves or not. Day 10 rolls around and we have no news, which is weird. Day 12, so then I called them and I was like, by the way, you know your deadline's coming to an end. I just want to make sure you're not opposing this, because otherwise, you know, we might go through a process where we think we've won and then they're like, no, wait. So I reached out to them. They got the proceeding into the right person's hands and they said, okay, well, we'll probably oppose this, we'll be in touch. And 24 hours later, they called me and the lawyer from the DPJ had gotten the proceeding and she said, I read it and I think you're right. I think we should have evaluated them. So that's what I'll recommend to my client, and I'll be back in touch with you tomorrow. And she did, and they said, they folded. They just said, you are correct. Like, we read this, you're right. We're gonna take it back, we're gonna evaluate them, and they put them in the process to evaluate them. And so through that process now, these 3 guys get to maybe be parents. In the meantime, they did actually get accepted in the project. And so that, to me, like, that was just, I think, one of the biggest victories, because you change these guys' lives, you change a kid's life, you know, and it doesn't make a case, like it doesn't, there's no case that shows that online. Nobody knows about it, but it changes people's lives, like, really. And these guys, they were ready to fight for years, knowing that they might never win and they might never have a kid. Even if they won, they knew they might be too old by then, their chance would be gone. But they were willing to do it. And they fought and they actually got it. And I think that's the case I'm proudest of.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing. It's difficult to share something after these very moving and inspirational stories. I am very happy and proud of my trajectory, which is an unusual trajectory. I am not a litigator. I had an experience in Colombia. I didn't like it. I'm very impatient, so I like to see change kind of quickly, and especially if it's human rights, and if we are talking about grave human rights violations, you cannot just simply wait for a judge to have his coffee, analyze, when somebody is perhaps being tortured in a prison, right? So that's why my approach to law is very different. It's from an advocacy point of view, is from an international point of view. I have certainly collaborated, bringing some cases before the Inter-American System of Human Rights, which is a regional system of human rights for the Americas, including Canada. Although Canada has been good in keeping it to the lowest level possible, and we need to bring it up, for example. That's a pending task that many colleagues, including me, we have. And yeah, I'm proud, for example, of the many prisoners of conscience we contributed to release in the different countries of Latin America in my time with Amnesty International. By a prisoner of conscience, I mean somebody who has been in prison because of his or her identity or his way or her way of thinking, or the pacific or non-violent actions. Like, for example, a human rights defender who has been criticizing. I remember the case, for example, in Mexico, a group of human rights defenders had been criticizing the very high tariff of the electricity, and they were trapped like in a meeting with one of the representatives of this corporation, and then after the meeting, this representative accused them of being of having him kidnapped in his own office. So they were facing charges of kidnapping just because they met for a couple of hours in his office to discuss these very serious issues, because tariffs were that high that people were simply not able to access it. And in this area, which is very hot, that was very problematic. It was not just a luxury. It meant to have the basics to survive. So it was very difficult. And although I am proud of that moment, I must say my moments are not individual moments. These are collective moments, because these changes are brought by a collective. And yes, I know I designed like the campaign, I documented the case, I went to prison, I talked with them, I took their pictures. We designed in a whole team of people all these things to have this impact, and we managed to get these 3 human rights offenders out of prison, and I'm very proud of these type of moments, which are many, which is, I'm very happy to contribute to that. But at the same time, because I see sometimes the system as it is not enough. So we also work to advance law. And in this regard, for example, we contributed to advance a state protection program for human rights defenders at risk, including journalists and judges and others who operate with law. We contributed to have this program created in the government of Mexico, and it was the same in Honduras when we managed to contribute to have a law passed so that a specific program would be created. And I still believe I am 100% a lawyer. Although I'm 100% a doctor in sociology, I'm 100% a lawyer, and I believe this is how we practice law, and that's how I see law. But perhaps, and this is very intimate, my proudest moment is when, you do a PhD, it takes very long, like in my case, 5 years, then you are so happy, and then, so what? Did you actually contribute something with this PhD? So my actual dream was to have some impact in practice and also in policy. And I'm very happy to say that I have presented my findings, my doctoral and postdoctoral findings, to indigenous women leaders and other indigenous people across the Americas, and it makes sense to them. So I'm very proud, I'm very, moved when these things that we produce from a legal background, from a sociological analysis, make sense in practice. And I have been invited by some of them to continue developing my studies, learning with them from their own experiences. And also, I'm very happy to say that last year was the 25th anniversary of the Human Rights Defenders Declaration approved by the General Assembly of the United Nations. And the special rapporteur of this specific mandate, the Human Rights Defenders mandate, quoted and cited my PhD thesis in her report to commemorate this specific declaration. And that felt like truly big. Of course, it's like a couple of paragraphs, but that is this work. And it's not my work, it's our work when I think of all the indigenous women leaders and communities who have participated and who have shared with me all their experiences so that I could learn and I could make sense of it in this academic work. So these are the main ones, but of course I have many other moments, and I'm very passionate about what I do, and it should also be the same for you. Don't think that it's only one way of litigating, because I very much admire you for your patience and your insistence, because sometimes it's not that easy to work with that specific system. But to work with law also means that you can work in different ways with different tools to change that system, perhaps, or to make it do things in a different way that perhaps is more effective than doing it in the more traditional way.
Yeah, so you've all touched on some wins that were very meaningful to you in terms of challenging social injustices, whether that be through legal practice or even in academic spaces. How do you confront or contend with the challenges that you may encounter in these processes? Whoever would feel comfortable starting.
Okay. Well, challenges, there are plenty of challenges. Yes, that for sure. I have 3 lines of work, actually. One is my academic work, my consultancy work, and my pro bono work. In my pro bono work, I only work with people who have been victim of human rights violations, and of course I don't charge anything to them, and there are plenty of obstacles. Many of them are human rights defenders in exile, and many of them are women. So you can imagine how many challenges they can face in places where they don't belong, and after fleeing because of these very intense, violent moments. So how I confront those? With a network of support. We have to be one step ahead. Whatever you think of, do not only think of learning and do your bit. you really need to be ethical in this type of, at least in my type of work. So we have managed to create some network of support with psychologists, with some activists, with people who are simply there to share their solidarity and perhaps send something that they need or receive them for a few days or something like that. So that's one aspect of it. In my academic work, of course, I also have to face, and in my consultancy work, I also have to address authorities and also corporate actors. And that's not always easy because they can be like not really trusting you or really interested in your work or not consider it actually important because, of course, it's more important to be talking about other subjects and not these, exceptional type of things that they think they are so exceptional and not really relevant to what they do. So it is a challenge to show them the importance of addressing and these type of topics, the topic of indigenous women leaders facing abuses. And also it's very challenging that often they are not seen as legitimate human rights defenders. They are generally seen as troublemakers, and in some cases they are generally seen as criminals. So then it's like you are like talking from a point of view of legitimacy and legality, and they are looking at you as the person who is talking about these troublemakers who are stopping, I don't know, the construction or something, or traffic or whatever. So it's not always easy. But how I do address this, I do my research, and I am certain about what I'm saying, and I corroborate my facts. That's why research for me is so important. And it goes from the life story of understanding this person and the complexities of this person as an individual, as a collective, because it's not just the person isolated, it's the person in as part of this group or as part of this community or this organization. And with that certainty, after doing this research and crossing it to different methodologies that allow me to see with certainty and to say what I have to say, I am just relaxed, and I just, whatever response they give me is very important for my research, whether positive or negative, whether they are reluctant or not, because that is demonstrative of the situation I'm trying to understand. So that's kind of a very big question for me because there are so many challenges and difficulties, but at the same time, all I can say is ethically, consistently, research thoroughly, be certain of what you are saying, do your homework, and be serious about what you are doing because you are dealing with people's life.
Okay, so one, I love this idea of troublemakers. I think like the history of legal progress is a history of troublemaking. History has this like sanitizing effect a little bit, and we sort of forget that the sort of great heroes of legal progress are almost uniformly criminals in their own time. And I think that is the case for every major movement towards social justice in the last century at least. It's certainly the case in the women's rights movement. I taught a class at McGill called Disobedience and the Rule of Law last year, where we invited Dr. Rebecca Gompertz, who runs Women on Web, Women on Waves, an organization that promotes access to abortion, in some cases in international waters, and in other cases allowing people to order abortion pills online. And so despite the fact that in many cases that access is either regulated away or outright criminalized. And so understanding that part of doing legal work around social justice issues is really about like navigating that line of legality, understanding what the Overton window is of like what is possible within our like legal and policy infrastructure, and then just like stretching it just a little bit outside of what people think might be possible. I think that's really like the art of doing interesting and impactful social justice litigation and social justice legal work more generally. a lawyer who passed away a couple years ago, who I really deeply admire, Joe Arve, who built a good chunk of this country's equality rights jurisprudence, often said that like lawyers are just plumbers with words, and I really think that that is basically how I think about my work, is that we're just we're just I mean, law is really just about reorganizing power through language, right? And so that is our tool set, and that's the work we're doing. And so part of when you talk about dealing with adversity or dealing with conflict or facing barriers or facing injustice, I mean, like the work is, I think, the strategic work of figuring out like where that line is and then just stretching a little bit. Like that's what you can get away with as a lawyer, and maybe it's not good enough, but it's sort of what we've got. But I think one of the ways that I think about my practice in sort of response to this idea of like how slow the law can be, how slow litigation can be as a tool, is like this framework of what we call like movement lawyering. This idea that being, we have this like very like old white guy idea of like the hero lawyer working in isolation. Like this idea maybe comes out of like Perry Mason and like kind of weird New Deal politics and whatever else. But really, transformative legal work is not about some random lawyer sitting alone in their office and like having an idea. Like law is necessarily a kind of conservative institution, and our courts and our legislators are always catching up to what's happening in the streets. And so a framework of thinking about your legal work that is like allied and working really closely with community organizations and social movements is one that's like most, and I see that in both of your work in different ways, is really like, I think where that's like how you get the goods, we have two cases that we did in the last couple years that I think really kind of speak to that is one during the COVID-19 curfew here in Quebec. We took an emergency injunction on behalf of the Mobile Legal Clinic, which is an organization that works with people experiencing homelessness in the city, to put an end to the pandemic like fines that for people violating the curfew, for people experiencing homelessness. That's a case that came to us because of a direct need on the ground from people who were, in addition to struggling to find ways to eat and house themselves and take care of their very immediate needs, were all of a sudden experiencing an even greater degree of policing and state violence on a discriminatory basis. And they're like, we got the file, and 72 hours later we got the judgment. And that's like, a really cool and important little victory. And then another is a case that I'm kind of limited in what I can say right now, but we filed a class action in the fall on behalf of the Immigrant Worker Center, which is an organization that some of you might know about, seeking human rights damages in relation to a large employer that basically makes food that goes onto airlines, and an agency, an immigration agency that was recruiting migrant workers under the false promise of legal work in Canada. In that case, like, despite the fact that there's quite a bit that I can't say right now, I think one thing I can say is that case was filed, and a few weeks later, we were basically running a legal clinic that gave like hundreds of people access to lawyers in order to regularize their status in Canada, kind of against all odds. And so that's another opportunity, really. It's another story about how sometimes the pressure from the courts is enough to get things moving and mobilize resources to make material differences in people's lives.
You've covered a lot of challenges, but in what's left, I think, there's clearly in practice obvious challenges like funding. Sometimes, you really, really want to take a case on and you think it's super important, and they don't have money to pay for it, and then how do you manage to get the case forward? And sometimes you can fight for it in your firm, like we both, I think, work in places that will support what we want to do most of the time. Sometimes they can't afford it either. And sometimes you're out of luck. And that's a challenge that's really hard to deal with, because you want to do something, but sometimes you're not equipped and you're not the one making the decisions. That can be tough. But I think also, I was thinking of this idea of challenges and the idea that things move slowly. And that can be a challenge for me to deal with, for instance, as a lawyer as well. Like, I've worked in cases where you know that what's at stake matters so much to people. Like, it's a life or death thing for some folks, and the system doesn't always get that. The people on the other side don't necessarily get that. The judge who's on the bench doesn't necessarily get that. And you have to take the time to go through the system, and you tell people it's urgent, hear us faster, and they'll hear it faster, which means in like 2 years instead of 3, or like a year instead of 18 months, which is not fast enough still. And yet, you have to go through, yes, all the hurdles. You also have to go through educating the bench being the judge who's hearing you, which is also very frustrating at times, because again, you know how much this matters to people, and somebody else is completely aloof to it, and in a sense, okay, they live in a different world, fine, but you have to go back and explain things in a very basic way, making sure you're being clear, making sure you're covering everything, to then get to argue for these rights that you're arguing for, and try and convince somebody. And it can be a challenge when you know it matters, you know it needs to be done fast, and yet you're a cog in the machine and you have no choice but to go through it that way. So I think that's, yeah.
Just add,
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to add something. When I said that I'm not a litigator, or that I, feel that it's very slow, that is very true. But at the same time, I don't want to leave you with the perception that I am against it. All the contrary, it is fundamental. We really need to use the system. Otherwise, what are we doing, right? And that's why we need very well prepared lawyers. And if you are thinking of law, think of law like a fundamental tool that we need to use. In my specific doctoral research, my question is, what explains that some indigenous women-led movements have impact on the practice of some corporations that are involved in mega projects where human rights violations have been committed. So how this indigenous woman leader and her group can impact on one of the most powerful actors of the world. Let's say how Berta Cáceres, who you may have heard from before, from Honduras, who was actually killed in reprisal for her work, how she managed to get the World Bank out of the Lenca, indigenous Lenca territory of Honduras, which is such an impoverished area and country. In my findings, which I develop a theoretical framework that I call the braided action framework. And in essence, just a tiny drop of it, but it's just like, we need to braid our actions. And what it means is that there are legal actions, institutional actions, and non-institutional actions. And they all are important. And we need them at different levels. And for example, you may want to use the media, but if you go to the media without the legal support, you won't have the same weight, If you go to the media and you say, look, we filed this complaint and we have been waiting like forever and nothing is happened and these people is in this situation, the reception and the impact of your words will be very different. So that's why I said before, law is so important, but it doesn't mean that we can improve it, or that we can look at it differently, or that we need to design it in a different way. That's just what I wanted to add. Thank you.
I'll add to that as well, because I think it points to also the power of how we need to collectively work towards things. And in the bigger cases that I've worked on, where, again, like there's an urgency, there's an issue, and most people don't see it, you actually work with like nonprofits who will help you kind of get things to the media. You work with other people, who will help educate the population, who will help raise people to go and protest. Like it's a collective effort. And I think that also touches on your point about how being a lawyer is a lot of things, which I think is a very important point, especially to make here. Like you have lawyers, like we're probably the most stereotypical type of lawyer there is. We're litigators. But a lot of the friends that we went to law school with, that we clerked with at the Supreme Court, they're doing a lot of other things. And some of them you don't even think that they're law, or you don't even think how you would get there. But again, your path kind of takes you different ways, but people wind up working in nonprofits. They work for the government. They take their legal education and go into something that you wouldn't think a lawyer does. But it's building blocks that help you know how to formulate arguments to fight for what you think matters. And that's useful kind of no matter where you end up. And I think, that's also legal education, and that's also a lawyer.
Wonderful. So what I'm really hearing is there are definitely a lot of challenges. That's without a doubt. But also really this emphasis on collective care and being in a collective together, and it being a little bit less scary when you're doing it not alone, because it's not possible technically. It's not possible to do it alone. You don't want to be doing it alone, So there are some challenges, that's for sure. Now, something that we were really interested in talking about, again, to whatever you feel comfortable, are more like the limits and potentials. So something specifically is, how do you choose on to take or take on certain projects or take on certain work? And what are some of the factors that you feel are really important when taking on these projects or work to consider? And is it possible to balance them?
Okay, so I think there's many layers to that, but I think that, one thing I think is something that, I teach law students too, and one of the things, a conversation that I think is really helpful to have with them, and is maybe helpful to have in this context too, is that injustice can be really immobilizing. Sometimes we feel like we have to have a grand unified theory of political and economic justice before we act. And in part, this is a bad habit that comes from being in a university context sometimes, is that we get really good at critique, and it becomes sort of hard to build. It becomes hard to do things because we see things through the lens of what's missing, what's problematic, what's not enough. And that is a useful way of understanding the world, but the fact remains that there is more than enough injustice to go around. There is a lot of work to do. And so when we think about how do we choose our next project, how do where to work, what everywhere all the time, do everything, do the next thing that looks slightly too hard, take on the project that is just out of your reach. I think that that's part of how increasingly I think about this kind of work, is that we can get so paralyzed by wondering about how we're going to have the most impact, or I think it becomes that's a really individual way of thinking. None of us is going to be on our little hero's journey saving the day alone. It's going to take everybody doing everything they possibly can, and I think that's a more generative, interesting, playful, meaningful, exciting place to be doing sort of social justice work anyway. And so that's sort of how I think about it. But then there's also we live in a world where there's limited resources, and we have to prioritize, and we have to decide where we're going to spend our time. And so do everything isn't exactly a strategic plan either. And so I think that when I think about this work in terms of my own, I've got 24 hours in a day type thing, increasingly the way I'm thinking about the next 5 or 10 years of my practice is I want to basically only be doing work where if I'm doing it, we're doing it to win. We have a plan to win. If we're going to do it, we're going to do it better than anyone else. Or I want to do work that nobody else is going to dare to take. Cases that are just a little bit too hard, just a little bit too complicated. That's the gap that I want to fill in my litigation practice. So that's how I think about that question, if that's helpful.
Absolutely.
I think our firms maybe work a little bit differently in this sense. And my firm, for instance, I don't necessarily get to pick all the cases that I work on. A lot of the cases I'll work on, the paid cases that I'll work on, I'll be working with somebody else because I'll have been assigned or I'll have been given cases. Sometimes people will call me directly to ask for my help on a case, and either I can take it on or not. And then sometimes people call me, mostly people call me to have my help on a case that they can't pay for. And those usually are, on the Venn diagram, there's a big correlation between the cases that people can't pay for and the cases that I'm interested in taking. Unfortunately, I can't take them all, but at least I'm in a place where I can take some of them, sometimes most of them, and some people don't have that luck. I mean, in law, in legal practice, in private practice, a lot of people at my level, even higher levels, can't necessarily choose to just take on a pro bono case. So that's just something important, I think, to be aware of. Again, I work somewhere where I'm lucky enough that I'm valued for the values that I hold and that I want to put forward and that I want to protect. So I'm also given the leeway to take these cases on sometimes. And usually what that means is I'll have to file a case with the pro bono committee and ask them if I can take on a case for free. I can't do that all the time. So that's where the kind of choosing comes in for me. How I choose them, it depends. Sometimes it's a matter of, am I the best person to do this? Am I the only person who can do this, either because of resources or because of knowledge? Sometimes I might not be the best person to do this, and I might refer to somebody if I think they're also able to take it on for financial reasons or anything else. Sometimes I know that I've just applied for another case and I just can't take on another one, and there's no point wasting this person's time having them wait for me to do an application that's going to get rejected. So it's sort of those things come into mind. Interestingly enough, the more I go with my practice, I didn't go and try and build a pro bono practice. I didn't go and try to build a discrimination in LGBTQ plus families practice. It just happened because I was interested in it, because I voiced my opinions about it, because I wrote about it, because then I took one on, and then this person talks to that person, and that person talks to another person, and now I find out I'm a specialist about some things that I did not even know were a specialty. And then that also means when I get those cases, I have to think, well, maybe I am the person to take these cases on, because maybe I can't just throw this to somebody else. But then again, maybe I also try and train, quote unquote, other people on these matters. Like I try to work with other people who can then at some point take on the case on their own and file their own pro bono application, and we can kind of divide and conquer, take on more cases. Sometimes if I don't have the knowledge about what I'm working on, because I work at the crossroads of, for instance, family law, discrimination law, other things. I actually don't know family law, I don't practice family law, but a lot of people who practice family law don't practice discrimination law or aren't specialists about LGBTQ plus issues or assisted reproduction technologies. So like sometimes it's about trying to work with somebody else in a sort of more or less official way, because we're not taught the things that we're trying to protect now. So it's a lot of things to think about when you're like, do I take on this case? Can I take it on? Sometimes I don't feel qualified, but nobody else is. So what am I gonna do? Mm-hmm. And that's when the interesting choices come, but that's also very interesting cases usually. And so it's mostly a matter of, if I think the firm will back me up on a case, do I think I'm the person to do this? Do I have enough energy and time to devote to this to do it right? Mm-hmm. And if not, can I ask somebody else for help? And then we move forward and try and do it together.
So there were two questions. One about the limits and the potentials. Don't know if you want to add something to that? Okay. In regards to limits, I kind of already told you that I genuinely felt a limit in regards to international human rights law towards the situation of people who are defending human rights in the region, but globally. I simply felt that we were not kind of seeing things that the law were not letting us see. So that's why I went to do the PhD in sociology, and it did work a lot for me to realize other things. So just to give you an example, like how important it is to understand indigenous legal systems and how can we integrate them in the human rights law practice and in the human rights work. So that's something that I just leave it there. Is because it's too big like to detail, but it's very important. But the potential is kind of linked to this, and is law and the legal system is not defined, written in a stone thing. It's evolving, it's moving, and it has to respond. Sometimes takes its time, but it has to respond to reality. And I see a lot of potential there, because that's where we can transform things for the benefits of many others who are in very difficult situations or many problems that we don't see because the legal system itself don't let us see it as a problem. So that's where I see a lot of potential. Just to be brief on that one, because again, that could be like a big topic. How I choose my work? Well, as I mentioned before, I have 3 ways of working. Academic work, consultancy work, and pro bono work. And the three of them are interlinked. I work with and for human rights defenders at risk. So right now I am focusing my academic work, developing my Red 8 action framework, and I'm doing it in dialogue with human rights defenders. In my consultancy work, of course I said no because I am writing my book, but then, there are things that you can simply say no because they are too important and too big. Like, I was approached by the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights from the United Nations, and they said we need to diagnose what is the situation of human rights defenders in Chile. And I said, no, I can't, pass this to another colleague. And they said, no, we know there is, a situation also with indigenous people there, and you have an expertise there. And then my heart was like, my book is, going to be delayed, but I had to say yes to this one because it's going to have, I hope, like a national impact because it will go directly to the government that is discussing the initiative of having a human rights defenders protocol or program. So there are things that you can simply say no, and you just have to help yourself in organizing yourself better and see how can you not forget about this very important commitment of the book. And also, I also say yes because it was linked to it. All what I do is linked to it. It helped me also like to further develop what I'm presenting in my my plan of having this manuscript. And the pro bono work is the same because when you work with human rights defenders or activists or social movements, it's not a one-off. At least for me, that's how I don't see it like, yeah, you pay for this case and then I leave. No, I am committed to their causes. So it's like, last year, again, they invited me, some of the women in exile. They are fighting to get, or not fighting, they're struggling to have like a better position in the implementation of the United Nations Resolution 1325, which is about the inclusion of women in peace processes and in any negotiation or discussion about the end of war and other things. And of course, women in exile, when you are out of this problem, people just simply assume that you are in a very wonderful situation because you are not anymore in this conflict area. But it's never like that, There are so many problems, so many challenges. So I also said yes to these women who had this very important event in Bogota, bringing women from 50 different other places around the globe, all of them women in exile, to discuss with the United Nations and with many other embassies about the inclusion of women in exile in this very important process of implementing this resolution in Colombia. And for me, it's not like a clear-cut formula of, yes, I accept this or I don't. No, I really am working with them. And that's part of my methodologies, is a community-based research action methodology. My research and my work, my legal work, has to be useful for them in the process and not only in the result, either an article or a book or whatever. And that's how it gets a very strong product or a very strong thing to say, because it's not something out of the abstract desk where you sit and look at papers. It's built with that and a dialogue and a process, and then you understand things in practice. So in essence, I just simply accept what is in line with what I'm doing, with my values, with my ethics. And of course, there are things that are like, very aligned, and I am overwhelmed because these are all big issues. But we have a group of colleagues, many of them former Amnesty researchers, where I could say, you know what, why don't you take this and let's work together, or, just do it yourself and tell me, I look at the end, or we work collaboratively, because it can get like very big. And these are problems that you cannot simply ignore. I mean, I wouldn't be able to have my sleep, thinking that I didn't do anything for a person in a very complicated situation or dangerous situation. So collaboration is very important.
Absolutely. And I think something that we were really curious to ask about, as you talk a little bit about the challenges and how you choose the work that you do. More broadly speaking, what do you, the three of you, perceive as the limit or the possibilities to enacting change through the field of law? Is that possible? And again, like not just the limits, but also the possibilities of changing the law.
So on the point of limits, I think you're right. I skipped that part of the question. I think we have to remember that law is a tool, and it's just a tool, and it's not an end in and of itself. And a change in the law doesn't always mean a change on the ground. It's a part of the fight. It's not the end. And other people need to, take that and keep moving with it, and you need to help them keep moving with it. And just as an example to that, I worked a little bit on a case that my firm took a long time ago for the Center for Gender Advocacy. So that's a case where we went to court to essentially give transgender and non-binary people access to birth certificates that actually match their gendered as they feel it, that don't misgender them, that they can have an X on or they can have an M on or an F on, whichever they actually feel and are. This has been going on for years. This is a challenge that started a long time ago. It took a really long time to even get a judgment back on the law is slow. And yet, even though we got a judgment that was favorable, most chunks of which are definitive, there are changes that still haven't taken place. The Civil Code of Quebec is supposed to recognize the right of non-binary folks to have an X on their paperwork. You still can't get an SAAQ driver's license with an X on it. People have trouble getting a RAMQ card that matches their X, And why? Because governmental agencies are apparently still waiting for some kind of a guidance. And we go, but the law says this. We've changed the law. We have changed the law. And yet, we have changed the law now almost 3 years ago. And yet. And now we're on appeal on some other things. And it's incredibly frustrating, back to get to the whole, the frustration of law sometimes and the slowness of it. And that's where the limit is, right? And you just need other people to come and help with that. Back when the judgment came out, the government was supposed to make changes to the Civil Code of Quebec, so our law, our written law, to acknowledge that non-binary folks exist and that they have a right to their paperwork matching their identity. They came up with a projet de loi, so a draft law, a bill, that was just unbelievably problematic. It was so bad. We read it, and I was at IMK by then. I was working with the lawyers working on this case, and we were just shell-shocked. And then we had to fight that, and we couldn't do that on our own. We're the lawyers, sure, but we worked with a lot of other people from NGOs, other people who are lawyers who just have expertise on the matters and who could go and talk in the Assemblée and could make representations as well, because this was unbelievable, and everybody needed to get up and collectively just scream about it and complain about it. And eventually that led to another change in the law, and the law that was implemented is much better than that law, even though it could be better. But it's a process, and it's a sad thing and a difficult thing that you get all the way to a judgment and still, but it's a truth, and we all need to kind of work together and work with folks who are not necessarily in the litigation business to make things keep moving. And at the same time, there's also a lot of potential, because we did go through and bring that case and change the law. And it is a major judgment in so many ways. And it's a seminal judgment that people study and look at and use as a basis to make arguments about why other injustices should be righted. And I sometimes work with students on legal clinics or things like that, and they come and they've read some cases, they've come prepared to discuss discrimination, and they've read that case. And it's always kind of amazing when you're like, yeah, I did a little bit of work on that, and it makes a difference, and it has potential, and then it might not right away have all the potential that it could have, but it builds over time. It builds, and everything building together kind of gives you more and more strength every time to your arguments, more credibility, more change. So.
Yeah. I think in terms of thinking about the limits of the law or the potential of the law, I think it's always compared to what? and I think that this framework of like law as one tool in your toolbox for social change is really the right way of looking at it. I think that, you know, sometimes we win in the streets, sometimes we win in the courts, sometimes we win in the classroom, sometimes it's all three of these places or somewhere else altogether, but like it's rarely that there's like one site of contestation, one site of victory, one site of defeat, and I think that we just need to be open to this idea that like any meaningful social change work is going to have to happen on all fronts, and it's going to be long and complicated, and there is no linear story of victory on pretty much any issue that matters, you know. I think often about one of my best friends works on abortion access in Canada, and you know, despite the fact that abortion is your legal right, your access to a safe abortion is your constitutional right, the reality is that lots of pregnant people in Canada don't have real meaningful access to that right, that costs are prohibitive, travel is prohibitive, religious discrimination plays an issue, medical discrimination plays a part in that. And so this idea that, you know, Henry Morgentaler went to the Supreme Court like 3 times, I think? And then there was a class action in Quebec years later to force the RAMQ to cover those costs. And anyway, so this idea that there's like, you know, there was this like one day where like you didn't have access to an abortion and then you did, like that's not how social change happens. It's not how legal change happens. And so we just need to have a way more complicated perspective on all of this. I think when you talk about the difference between, and you know, what the law says and the reality, I think often of the context of solitary confinement. Our firm is one of several across Canada that plays a role in a massive class action against the federal government, and there's a parallel class action against provincial governments in most provinces now for the practice of solitary confinement in Canadian prisons. And for decades, there was this mass movement to end this practice that amounts essentially to torture. You know, mobilization on all fronts, legislative change and political change and legal advocacy, and finally there was a judgment awarding a sort of unprecedented amount of damages to individuals, many of whom are women in Canadian institutions, and those women are overwhelmingly Indigenous women in Canadian prisons. Very, very large damage awards, and the process of getting people access to that money is like slow and complicated and sometimes demoralizing. And but what's essential is, despite the fact that there were these judgments recognizing that the practice of solitary confinement represents an egregious violation of people's constitutional rights in this country, essentially the practice just got renamed. There was a series of legislative reforms, but if somebody calls you from a federal institution today, you know, they're in, we don't call it administrative segregation anymore, you're in the SIU, and you know, the conditions are marginally better, but like the fact remains that the experience for that person is like more or less identical. And so this difference between what the law says, what the court says, and the change that happens in practice like can sometimes be illusory or just like not good enough. And so we can't, there's no like switch that goes off where it's like, oh, well, like now we're gonna just respect people's constitutional rights and everything's better. It's really, it's really a long process, but like, again, like our choice is like do that work or don't, right? So there's no like secret option 3 where, you know. So I'm proud to be doing the work, I guess.
Okay, that's a very big question. I already kind of advanced a little bit on that, but if, you know, law has advanced a lot. And let's focus only on the Indigenous women-led mobilizations facing abuses in relation to mega projects, my doctoral and postdoctoral work. When you look at that, definitely I'm very happy to see that things have advanced in a way that now we are talking about Indigenous rights. A few decades ago, that was not even possible. They were not even subjects with rights, right? So the law has advanced, and we can continue advancing it. I see a lot of potential there. And feminism and intersectionality has a lot to say and to do about it. When I see about when I think about the limits, there are plenty of limits. And perhaps I go one step back, and in my work, that's what I do. when I was working with the Wet'suwet'en and indigenous women leaders in British Columbia, I could clearly see how they were in a system that, when they went to court or when they were accused before the judicial system, they were not on an equal footing. They were not treated equally. They were not like the authorities in some of the events, on some of the incidents, violent incidents, did not treat them like if, was the lawyer there or the person from this corporation there. They were treated very badly. And there were things that clearly allow me to see how the legal system as an institutional system as a normative system was operating in a larger system of oppressions. And that was also something that I had already discussed in my work in Latin America, and I was hoping to see something different but better in Canada. And yes, I saw something different, but not necessarily better in some aspects, because many of the oppressive laws of the past are still being applied as I'm talking right now. And that is something that I just must say, the limits of the law is not perhaps the law itself, is the law that is part or that is within, within several systems of oppression that in my work I call a patriarchal, capitalist, and racist system of oppression. And legal systems are so much ingrained there. Having said that, the potential is that the legal system can, go away from that, change that, actually contribute to change that system. That's taking place, it's going slowly, it's happening, and it can go further. In my analysis, what I also see is the problem is not only what I just said, it is also that there are some anti-rights groups and people, and they work very hard to, push these human rights gains back and to return things to the status quo that really favor their private economic political interests. So when I look at law and the legal systems, I do it in a comprehensive way. So it's not just simply this tool, it is, part of a broader system. And as we can push further to have, many rights recognized and have them in real for people who really need to enjoy, and we all need to enjoy our human rights in full, there are others who are pushing back. And it's this continuum of this dynamic continuum of forces. And that would be just like my invitation, to see law as a moving, dynamic thing that we really need to think of that when we work on cases and with other colleagues to see how can we advance what we really want to advance, in my case for the benefit or for the actual enjoyment of rights of indigenous women leaders and their communities.
So you've all really spoken to this gap between theory of what the law says and practice. And Nancy, I think you really did a great job of contextualizing why that gap exists, namely like the systems that underpin this gap. And so hence why it needs to be tackled from different angles and through work that takes place in different spaces. And so my question is, within this matrix of spaces, how have you made a space for yourself in this field that most aligns with your values, your goals, your experiences? Laura, would you like to start us off?
I think I might have touched on that a little bit already. For me, I didn't set out to make a space for myself in any way. I don't think I set out knowing exactly where I wanted to be or what I wanted to do. And certainly my interests have changed over time, but I think what I followed was that passion that I had, that anger initially, and still anger a lot of the time, but it's also a lot of other things. And overall, I think it's a passion for making changes happen where I see that they're just being ignored, or that people don't even see that there's issues. And there's other issues that I'm sure I don't see and that I hope other people bring up, because that's we all have a diversity of experiences and a diversity of perspectives, and that's how we fill those gaps. But I think for me, I wound up making a space for myself a little bit by accident, just by pursuing the things that I was interested in and speaking up. And speaking up doesn't come naturally to me. I'm, in my background, I'm a shy person. I did not think I was going to be a lawyer initially because I'm not the person who likes to go and talk in front of a lot of people. But at some point, you get angry enough that that doesn't matter. And I think I started kind of writing about these things that angered me. And again, I'm not, I didn't want to go and write on a blog or write in the news or whatever. I just wrote in academic articles because I figured nobody would read me. A couple of people have. Every once in a while somebody writes to you and they're like, this article is really good. And you're like, oh wow, you actually know what I'm talking about and you like it too. And sometimes it's somebody who actually, I've gotten in touch with lawyers who work on the same issues as me across the country because we have these common interests. And so it's actually very interesting where you can wind up just taking a different path, right? And so I went, I think, from writing legal articles about things to then kind of bringing them up in my practice, more so initially to my bosses, depending on, if we were working on a case and I saw an issue from a different perspective that I thought wasn't taken into account, I would bring that up. And then from seeing that recognized and valued, and increasingly so, and trying to work in a place where that is increasingly valued and where I'm valued also because of those things, not despite of those things, not independent of them, but I'm valued because I have that perspective and because I raise it. And then I think I just, from there, wanted to do work based on those issues. And I wanted to be the one in charge of the work doing those issues. And I brought that to my workplace pretty early on when I changed firms and went to IMK. And I was supported with that. And I was encouraged, and I had people backing me up who are people who worked on way bigger cases than me and know a lot more than me. And they were backing me up to be able to do that and to bring cases. And that's how I wound up pleading something at the Supreme Court, because I read a case that came from Prince Edward Island, so you already know that not too many people are reading the case in the first place. And I just saw an issue that, to me, there was a discrimination issue towards LGBTQ plus people, and it was nowhere, there was nothing queer at all about this case. Nobody was reading it who was thinking that, but I saw it, I took issue with it. I went and talked about it with an organization. They were like, I see what you're saying. I think this is worth raising. And so I went and I said, firm, will you back me up if I want to raise this to the Supreme Court? And they said yes. And so I did. And that's, I think, the first time I went and was really on a bigger stage, talking about things that matter to me, about things that, it angers me that people aren't talking about it. And it was actually, that was the first time I was like, I'm here because I know nobody else is going to do it. Just because there aren't that many people who read this case, there aren't that many people who have my perspective who read this case, there aren't many people who read that case and have my perspective and have the resources to come and do this. And so I can, so I should, and I want to. And that's how I wound up, I think, kind of making a little space for myself. And it just grew from there organically, because people talk to people and because there aren't many people who kind of are at the intersection of legal issues that I'm at. And sometimes that takes you exactly in the direction you want to go. Sometimes it takes you in a different direction. I wind up working on cases that are not quite what I expected to be working on, but I love it. And I love that I'm helping people, and I answer what people need, not just what I want to see changed that, might actually not be an issue as much for people. So I think that's how I wound up there.
Okay, this idea of how you ended up making space for yourself, right? So I think that one of my greatest strengths in this way is that I was fundamentally oblivious to the rules of how you were supposed to succeed in law or in law school. And I think that if I had known the rules and expectations, like what you were supposed to, I don't know, what was expected to be admitted into law school, or what was expected to be an excellent Supreme Court clerk, or what a litigator was supposed to be. I think if I had known and internalized those rules, I think they would have been a real barrier to me. But because because they're not made for us. Exactly, they're not made for us. They're not made for people like us. And so I think that in part because I've always had friendships and working relationships outside of the law. It was never something that I mean, I didn't, I don't think I ever like even met a lawyer until I was 17 or 18 years old. I didn't grow up in a family where there was like an expectation to be a professional, or even where my parents might have even known anyone who was a lawyer. I think that was tremendously liberating because it really gave me the space to think about who I wanted to be, and how I was, what kind of work I wanted to do. And I think that we can get really caught up in the sort of rules of how to succeed. And so I think it's been a real blessing in my career that I just like didn't have that to begin with. And so this idea of like taking space, I mean, like maybe some of the space I've taken up has just been because I was like not aware that I wasn't supposed to be in the room. There was nobody impolite enough to tell me no. But I mean, I strongly encourage that way of being in the world personally. I think that you end up having a lot more fun. But I think that there's also this idea, like law is a very hierarchical institution, and there's often this idea that you're supposed to like wait your turn. And I think that it's especially women and young women who are told that they need to wait their turn, that you don't have enough experience, that you don't have enough seniority, you don't have enough clout, you don't have enough status, and like I think that's just very silly because I mean, like the amount of just talent that's just wasted by people who are like quietly waiting their turn is like one of the greatest sort of tragedies of our legal system. And so I just don't believe in that. And because I don't believe in it, I think I've had lots of very cool and interesting experiences and opportunities to make a difference. And so I just recommend just don't follow any of those rules, and you'll have a lot more fun that way.
Thank you. Okay, that's kind of a difficult question in a way for me because I'm still working in opening that space as how it has evolved. It's kind of an evolving thing. It's not like a finished thing that I'm in a space. Well, I don't think so. I'm still working on that. Yeah, I have been working like a lot, and I could have continued my career with Amnesty International, being in a high position perhaps, or continue my work as a professor in Colombia at Javeriana University. I have always being concerned about things that are not necessarily already answered by law or the system, and I can't just simply let them go. So I have to work with them, and perhaps that's my space, a continuous evolving space where I work with law and with other disciplines, and it's always collective and sometimes fully isolated, thinking, reflecting on different things. And as a woman, at that time when I studied law, well, I mean, a woman who would ever think that feminism would be something to talk about. Mm-hmm. We could easily get these very macho chauvinist jokes, and we would all laugh because we would not have even the critical tools to say this is wrong, right? This has changed a lot, and we opened a group of gender and law in our faculty, and it was discussed, and it became a problem. Yeah, but they couldn't close our group because it was so essential. So we just simply continue, and it opened one other thing, and it's like a chain of things and events. In the end, that's kind of my space. It's not really like definite, or right now, I never expected that I'm now super interested in learning from indigenous people about their legal systems and how can we work with those systems, and how important it is to have those systems included in international human rights law and in other laws, because by leaving them out, we are just simply replicating this hierarchy that oppresses these other people and that is, feeding this other larger system. So, and that is something I just kind of, in the last few years, I just started to learn because of my doctoral and postdoctoral work. Mm-hmm. So it's not like, I don't know if I'm actually answering your question, but yeah, I don't have like a definite space. I really need to, my space is with what I'm interested in doing and learning. Mm-hmm. It's not a space, or it's not time, I don't know. I need to think about that.
Yeah, there's also no right or wrong answer, right? Because I think as we're hearing, and as the audience is also hearing, the three of you are in such different fields, different areas, so there's no binary answer to that one at all. Yeah. I'm mindful of the time, something really important for this event is, yes, we had some questions to ask, but we also want to make sure that you guys can ask some questions. If there's any burning questions, So I think being mindful of that, I think we're going to go into our one of the last questions that was really important to talk to our three panelists about, and I'll hand it back over to Melissa.
Yeah, so just thinking back to all of these experiences that you shared with us today, and circling back to this notion of non-traditional career paths and the many turns that they may take, what advice would you give your past self and to like feminist students in this room?
Oh no. Okay. One piece of evergreen advice that I give to my students is that when you're young and ambitious, when you listen to advice other people give you, there's this little, there's sort of a trap, right? Well, if you want to be a lawyer, then you have to get good grades, or if you, want to run for office, then you have to do these things, whatever. Life is just not a video game where you have to go around collecting coins and accumulating points so that you can spend them eventually on the thing that you really want to do. It's all actually your life. The time you are sitting in your classroom, and the time you spend hanging out with your friends, and the time when you're a cabinet minister, and the time you're chilling on a beach, and it's all equally your life. And so this idea that you have to do a bunch of unpleasant, grueling stuff where you sacrifice your ideals or you're bored out of your mind, in order to one day self-actualize, I just think is fundamentally the wrong way of looking at it. I think that you become the best version of yourself by being that person every day and trying to live your values more deeply every day and do work that speaks to you more deeply every day. And so I think that my advice to young people is always just do the thing that feels most impactful and meaningful now. Don't worry too much about the 10-year plan. Do the work you can where you are with the tools that you have, and try and do the best you can there. I think that's how I think about this. I don't know if it's the right way to think about it, but that's the advice I have.
I don't know that there is a right way to think about it. I think my advice kind of came along the same lines. It was sort of just listen to yourself. People will give you advice. People who are doing exactly what you want to do will give you advice. That doesn't mean that advice is tailored to you. And in the end, you're the person who mainly, at the core, winds up living with your decisions, right? So you just want to make sure that you're comfortable with what you're doing. And if you choose to do something that you're not 100% comfortable with, make sure it's your decision, that's all. And I think, because I know I've sometimes followed advice other people gave me, and it didn't turn out for the best for me. And sometimes people actually discouraged me from applying to the Supreme Court because I wasn't the fit, I wasn't the profile. But one or two people said, do it anyway. And I was like, okay, I wouldn't be comfortable living with myself if I didn't try. I want to try, and if I fail, I fail, but I'll try. And I tried, and I succeeded. And sometimes, I'm glad I did. I'm glad I listened to myself and not what 95% of people were saying to me, because there's not a one-piece-fit-all advice. So if somebody tells you something, doesn't mean it's going to work for you, doesn't mean it's best for you. And, again, you're the one who kind of lives with those choices. And, beyond listening to yourself, when you're comfortable, express yourself as well. I know I wasn't comfortable expressing myself necessarily when I was younger. I grew into it, and in the end, it's what got me where I am. It's what got me into doing things that I like to do, and I don't see why I would stop, because it turns out my voice also expresses what some other people want and need, and I have the privilege to be in a place where my voice carries. And so I think that wound up being very important to me. So yeah.
Okay, I very much agree with what you both just said. I also believe in the same idea, of believing what you really want to do, what you want to say, work with it, do it the best possible you can. If you want to criticize something, learn first exactly what is what you want to criticize and why. Be the most solid possible in your argument. Understand things before you say something about something, that is fundamental. And whatever you really want to do, and it's really what moves you, you persist and insist. Sometimes it's not easy, but you know it's right. And if, you know, you can insist, you can persist, do not, you know, think that you failed because you got the wrong answer or what you didn't want to hear at first. You can continue and learn about the process. That would be my last thing to say, you know. This is a process, and it is a learning process. And learning from indigenous peoples, you know, they look at time and at life in a very different perspective. And it's so fascinating to learn from them how they don't see themselves as individuals acting individually. You know, they are always part of collectives. They are in interaction with nature. They are in interaction with other beings around, you know, something that we call like living and non-living beings. And learning from that is question yourself as well. You know, why do I feel so uncomfortable with something, or why do I feel so insecure with something? And perhaps it's not because of you, it's because what you have been taught before. So that is just relax and enjoy is kind of what I'm saying. And it is a process, and there is no right or wrong. Perhaps something didn't work out now, and it's because you needed to learn something, or because something better is going to happen, or because it was actually what was going to give you the argument that you were trying to find before. So it's just a learning process, and it should be enjoyable. And yeah, you are never like alone. There is always a lot of people and others beings around you, and changing that perspective can also be very helpful.
Right. I think this is a great point to wrap up our event, and I would like to thank you, Lex, Laura, and Nancy, for sharing your voices, your experiences, and your words of advice have deeply enriched this conversation. And thank you as well to everyone in this room for registering for this event and taking the time to join us in community, both in person and online. This event was made possible by a large support network. First and foremost, our co-organizers, Sophie, Emily, and Donna. Our volunteers, Paula, Sophia, Haya, and Christina, have also played a huge role in helping us make sure that everything runs smoothly. We'd also like to thank Fourth Space for hosting us, as well as ASFA's Dean Special Initiatives Fund, CCSL, and the Sustainability Action Fund for making this event possible. And lastly, we'd like to thank Dr. Painter and Dr. Manning for their unwavering support and their ongoing guidance as we put this event together. Thank you.
Yes, okay, thank you everyone for coming in today for this important and activating this conversation, also for all of your important questions. Everyone online, those of you on Zoom or YouTube, we will be closing up the live stream now, but a quick reminder to everyone that this conversation is already available on our YouTube channel if you'd like to revisit or share it. But please join us again. Keep an eye on our calendar. I hope to see you again at Fourth Space. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.